Beneath an Eltham moon, a true story. The year is 1976, and Eltham was Max's world. With a population of just over 2,000, it might seem just a quiet blip on the map to some, but to him it was a bustling hub of life, filled with familiar faces and the charm of a thriving small-town community. Life beyond Eltham seemed as distant as the moon. Impossible to imagine. At 22, Max was still finding his feet, trying to carve out a life for himself amidst the allure of adventure and the constant growing desire to find a girlfriend. Max had completed his apprenticeship as a mechanic at the local Ford dealership, a badge of honour that qualified him to work at the Kapuni natural gas plant. It was steady work, good work, and it paid well enough to fund his nights at the pub and his insatiable thirst for excitement. But the job came with its challenges, especially the grueling, unsociable shifts. He would work through the night, the drone of machinery his only companion, and by morning he would stumble home desperate for sleep. Yet, in the heart of Eltham during daylight hours, finding peace and quiet was no small feat. That was when Max had an idea. It wasn't conventional, and it certainly wasn't something most 22-year-olds would dream up, but it was his. He bought a 25-foot caravan, a cosy little home on wheels, and decided to park it at Tamata Park, right behind the local grandstand. It was an unusual choice, and the townsfolk made no secret of their amusement. "There goes Max," they were shaking their heads with a grin as he towed his new home into position. The setup was surprisingly practical. The local council charged him a small weekly fee, and in return he had access to power, showers, toilets, and even a kitchen if he needed it. However, the reality of winter brought its own challenges. The grandstand provided shelter, but did little to ward off the biting cold, especially in the mornings. Showering in winter was an ordeal, the icy water chilling him to the bone, making every breath a visible puff of steam. Still, Max endured it, finding a strange satisfaction in overcoming the discomfort. For a while, life in the caravan was exactly what Max needed. Quiet solitude, a chance to recharge after long nights at the gas plant. But Eltham being Eltham, people knew where to find him, and he would get the occasional knock on the door. Friends would drop by curious about the unconventional setup, or simply look for a chat. It was nice in a way to know he wasn't completely forgotten. Still, the peace grew stale after a while. Life felt too quiet, too still. That's when his mate Gary Bourne decided to shake things up. One evening over a couple of beers, Gary announced his plan to join Max at Tamata Park. He'd found himself a caravan of his own, and sure enough, and soon enough, there were two of them at the park behind the grandstand, turning heads and raising eyebrows all over Eltham. The two of them together brought a new energy to the park. Gary had a knack of making any situation lively, and the little caravan setup quickly became the stuff of local legends. Gary and Max both brought electric frying pans, and cooking became a nightly ritual. Their favourite meal was lamb with roast vegetables, and the smell of it wafting through the grandstand often drew envious glances from their mates. Gary's tabby kitten added to the camaraderie, following him everywhere, even around the grandstand. One time the kitten went missing for a couple of days, only to be found meowing faintly from a cutlery drawer in Max's caravan. It loved wandering all over the kitchen benches while they waited for their dinner to cook, adding a dose of hilarity to their routine. Despite the fun, there was a lingering sense of unease. Their mates had a running joke about sneaking in at night and towing their caravans away while they slept. What started as banter became genuinely concerning for Max and Gary, as their mad mates were more than capable of pulling off such a prank. They often found themselves double-checking locks, sleeping lightly just in case. When the shifts allowed, and Gary wasn't working his grueling hours as a digger operator or helping farmers with their hay, the two teamed up. Most of their activities revolved around boozing in the local pubs, fueled by the never-ending hunt for excitement, adventure, and, of course, girls. Some of those adventures were good, some not so good, but they were always memorable. At that time, Max started to think there might be more to life than Eltham. Watching TV had given him a glimpse of the bigger world, one filled with possibilities that he could not ignore. He began to wonder if he could follow the path of a few other Elthamites who had ventured to the North Sea oil rigs. The oil boom there was rumoured to be full of swing, with stories of fortunes to be made. It was enough to spark an idea. Max would go. He booked a one-way ticket to London with plans to catch a train to Aberdeen, Scotland, just 3 months away. But until then, he was determined to experience the best of Eltham. One night, after another lively evening, Gary and Max returned to the caravan, and over a cup of coffee, Max shared his plans with Gary. "Gary," he said, "I'm thinking of leaving Eltham and heading to Scotland. There might be better, more prosperous life out there. What do you think? You should come with me." Gary's response caught Max off guard. "Max," he said, with a chuckle, "what is the point in travelling all these exotic places? If you want to see them, just watch TV." His words troubled Max, but they struck. Ironically, years later, Gary would travel extensively, joining the oil and gas industry and residing in some of the most exotic places on earth. He would even tell Max with a grin how one year he circumnavigated the globe 9 times. The next morning, Gary had a suggestion. "Max," he said, "let's head to Hara tonight. There's a beer festival on a local hall." Hara, just 20 kilometres away, was unfamiliar territory to them, a chance for something different. That afternoon they piled into the car and drove to Hara. They booked 2 rooms at the Central Hotel and made sure to figure out how they could access after hours. Then, with great excitement, they set off to find the beer festival. What would the night bring? Neither of them knew, but they couldn't wait to find out. It was a welcome escape from the familiar walls of the Eltham Tavern. Surely it couldn't be that bad. The two had a great night, singing German songs alongside the locals, clinking their beer mugs, which they had been gifted, and donning their new Bavarian hats. By midnight, the night wound down, and Gary and Max, still in high spirits, began to walk back to their hotel, singing arm in arm. As they made their way down the dimly lit street, the air seemed thickened with a strange tension. Across the road, a group of guys stood huddled, their conversation abruptly silenced as their eyes fixed on Max and Gary. Max recognised one of them, Warren, a guy he'd seen around Eltham. Warren was dating a local Eltham girl who lived on Julian Street. The uneasy feeling in Max's gut grew sharply as one of the men broke away from the group and marched towards them with a determined look of aggression. Before he could react, the man was in his face, yelling, shoving him, his eyes burning with manic intensity, and sent a chill down Max's spine. Gary stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, but it was no use. Friends rushed over, pulling him back, but their efforts seemed only to fuel the guy's rage. Suddenly, he pulled out a large knife from under his jacket. The blade gleamed under the flickering streetlights, and Max's heart dropped. "Run, Max!" Gary shouted, his voice cutting through the haze of fear. Max didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, the sound of pounding footsteps echoing behind him. His lungs burned as he darted around the back shops, weaving through narrow alleyways and clambering up into the rooftop. His heart thundered under his chest as he crouched in the shadows, straining to listen for any sign of his pursuer. The night felt endless. Every creak and rustle amplified his terror. Finally, the silence settled. Max cautiously peered over the edge of the roof, scanning the deserted streets below. Convinced he'd lost him, he climbed down and made his way back to the hotel, every step haunted by the lingering adrenaline. Gary pale and visibly shaken, had already called the police, fearing the worst. When Max stumbled into the lobby, the relief on Gary's face was palatable. The officers questioned them, and Max described the man and the knife, identifying Warren as one in the group. A few weeks later, the police informed them that they'd caught the attacker. He claimed he was suffering from depression. A thin excuse did little to erase the memory of the knife glittering in the dark. The incident made the local Hara newspaper, though only small column. It was just another curious story. But to Max, it was a night he would not forget. A few weeks later, Gary and Max were in a friend's car around midnight, dropping off another mate near Julian Street. The night was quiet. Max's heart skipped when he saw Warren walking towards his girlfriend's house. Something primeval surged within him, and without thinking he leapt out of the car, adrenaline pumping. "Warren!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Stop!" Warren turned, his face flashing fear, and he bolted. Max chased him down the street, his footsteps pounding like war drums. When Warren reached the house, he didn't slow. Instead, he drove straight through the glass door. A shattering crash echoed through the night. Max skidded to a halt, the chaotic scene snapping him back into reality. Shards of glass glittered on the porch as he hesitated. Realizing the mayhem he'd unleashed, Max turned and sprinted back to the car, his heart racing as they drove off into the night, the tension lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. There never was any further engagements with Warren. The slate was now even. The chapter of Max and Gary's sharing adventures was ending. Their time together, full with laughter and chaos and camaraderie, had been a defining moment of their lives. But as Max prepared for his journey to Scotland and Gary pursued his own path, they knew their memories and escapades would always remain. This was not the end of their friendship, only the end of this chapter, a chapter that left them both with stories they would tell for years to come. Some 50 years later, they would meet again, their friendship rekindled, but that's another story.